Good afternoon. I'm about to answer a question that was put to me by our esteemed festival recording engineer, Paul Levin, as part of our feature, Ask Elizabeth. I hope you enjoy it. Here is Paul's question. Elizabeth, you are now a time traveler through the otherwise historically accurate Baroque period. From the 1600s through the 1750s, where, city or court, would you have liked to work? And why? Feel free to mention any close seconds. It's a great question, Paul. I love how it leaves me free to just run wild across the continent. And particularly in the light of our thwarted festival last June, which had a theme of a grand tour of Europe and beyond, so unappealing in the age of COVID. Oh, timing was terrible. I am shamelessly taking your question as an invitation to create a sort of musical travelogue. As I began thinking, I realized that if I were only concerned with the music that I could have played or listened to in any given city or court, I could probably have been happy anywhere. I love all the regional styles and temporal styles in the Baroque era. So I think I'll just present you with a list of my top 6 places, in no particular order, but based on exactly the repertoire that I was likely to be able to be part of in those times and places. What you will see after I introduce each one of these 6 places are some images from that place. Images also can create reasons to be somewhere, but also I will include a short snippet from a recording of music from that time and place. And the music should be taken by you as the answer to why I would want to have worked in that time and place. First up is Vienna in the early to mid-17th century, when Johann Schmelzer and Heinz Ignaz Franz von Bieber were working there or nearby. They are 2 of my very favorite composers, brilliant writers for the violin, and just so full of goodness and interest and friendliness and humanity in their music. The music you'll hear now is the opening of Schmelzer's wonderful Sonata 4 in 6 parts, and the performance is by Voices of Music. Next up is London in Purcell's all too brief lifetime in the late 17th century. You will see the exterior of the Queen's Theatre, Dorset Gardens, where many of Purcell's masques and semi-operas were performed, and they will be accompanied by a chaconne from his masque, King Arthur. No British travelogue could possibly be considered complete without an image of Westminster Abbey, and I could have worked there. That's where Purcell's glorious vocal sacred works were performed. You're about to hear a brief bit of his exquisite ode performed at the funeral of the beloved Queen Mary II, In the Midst of Life, performed by the stellar vocal ensemble Vox Luminis. Steering my time vessel now some 40 plus years forward, I find myself still in London. Purcell is dead and gone, and it now is the heyday of Handel's operas and oratorios. You will hear the beginning of the aria Furibondo spira il vento from his opera Partenope, performed by the phenomenal countertenor Christopher Lowry and the Voices of Music Ensemble again. While still in London, I might have also been found on a barge on the River Thames, playing Handel's water music during his famous but quite possibly apocryphal reconciliation with King George I. For those of you who don't know this legend in music history, briefly it goes like this. A very young Handel, still in Germany where he was born and grew up, got a job as a Kapellmeister, sort of like a concertmaster, at the court of Prince Georg Ludwig, the Elector of Hanover. Well, that was a good job for a young man particularly, but Handel was a very ambitious young man who wanted to travel the world, meet musicians and composers from everywhere, and just take in the world. And he applied for a leave of absence not long after taking the job. It was granted to him, a temporary one. He overstayed it, came back, they were already ticked with him, and he only stayed long enough to apply for another one, which ticked them off even more, possibly the king, ticking the king off. This is not a good thing to do. He got the second leave, and this time temporary turned into never. He just didn't come back. So it's not really a good thing to do that to a king. So the legend says the prince was mad, held a grudge for quite some years. Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know. In any case, after Handel went off to Italy, he wound up in London, settled in London, and began to make his fortune. A fairly considerable fortune. He was just phenomenally successful. And just a few years after he did that, who should appear as the new King of England but his former boss, Prince Georg Ludwig, who's part of the Hanoverian line of succession, and when his mother Sophia died, he was next in line. So there he was, the new King of England, rubbing shoulders with Handel in London. I don't think they were rubbing shoulders, though. I mean, they were in very different worlds. It's not clear whether the king was really ticked off at Handel or not. But the legend says, and it's a kind of a sweet legend, that Handel decided he needed to get back into the good graces of the king, which is a very useful thing to have, the good graces of a king if you're a lowly musician, and also just to apologize for his very boorish behavior. So he wrote the water music and invited the king out onto the river for a party. It's a nice story. We don't know if it's true. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that the king was interfering in Handel's career in any way. Handel just had a steady meteoric rise from success to success during the early years of King George I's reign. But it's fun. The jury's out on that. Nobody really knows. So he wrote the water music and went out on the river in this incredible party that everybody in London who had a boat or a piece of wood that they could row went out and joined in. It was the event of the year for sure. And I think a very good time was had by all. King George fell in love with the water music, had to hear it at least 3 times. They went up to Chelsea on the River Thames, they came back, had to hear it once going up, had to hear it once coming back, and had to hear it after they landed. So it was a huge success for Handel in many ways, I'm sure. And so what you're going to do now is see a lovely little painting by Edouard Hamon, a Belgian painter, who painted a very intimate and charming little painting of Handel seated on the royal barge with King George in earnest conversation. It's a very lovely little painting. And after that you will see a beautiful Canaletto painting painted some years after this event. In fact, it wasn't painted for this event. It was painted to celebrate Lord Mayor's Day. And you can see the beautiful Cathedral of St. Paul, designed by Christopher Wren, in the background. And you can see a whole lot of boats on the river. So just imagine in your mind that there were oh, so many more boats, that people were banging into each other because there were probably that many boats on the river on the day of the Water Music Festival. You will also hear the hornpipe from Handel's Water Music, performed by the Göttingen Handel Festival Orchestra, conducted by Lawrence Cummings. Leaving London at last and dialing my time vessel backwards about 15 to 16 years, I find myself over the English Channel, then over the Swiss Alps, and arriving in Venice when Vivaldi was flourishing there. The painter Canaletto, who is 15 or 16 years younger now, has obligingly painted Venice for you, and you will see that painting. And the music you will hear is Winter from Vivaldi's famous Four Seasons, performed by yours truly with Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra. I'm fast forwarding to 1745 because perhaps now I can play in one of my very favorite of Rameau's ballets, Platée. You will hear the Orage, or Storm, from that ballet, Platée, performed by Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra under Nicholas McGuigan. Last but not least, a rather vague destination called Anywhere Where Bach Was Living. Well, this is where I ran into trouble, actually. I thought my first choice in answering this question would involve Bach because I am so very, very in love with his music. So I thought, I'll travel back to Leipzig, and then I can stay there for a few years and be part of a brand new cantata every Sunday. That sounds great. That's when it hit me. I could not have traveled and worked in any of the places that I've been showing to you because I'm a woman. Women did not perform publicly in that time, in those cultures. It was even unusual if a woman was interested, she was usually not even afforded the opportunity to master an instrument. I could have been a singer, but I'm not a singer. But if I had been a singer, then I could have possibly become an opera singer and performed in the great opera houses. But that's not really an option for me, being a violinist. Bach? No operas there. I think there was no Bach for me. He used boys. We all know he used boys' choirs. And in fact, it's interesting, it turns out that the Lutheran Church at that time forbade women to sing in church because they believed that St. Paul himself had forbidden it. What St. Paul apparently actually said was, let your women keep silent in the churches. And the Church of Bach's time interpreted that to mean they can't even sing. I have to say, although the boys were undoubtedly gifted and lovely and all of that, I think this was a real tragedy for women in some ways, and really not the greatest piece of theology or doctrine, if you ask me. The founder of the Lutheran Church, Martin Luther, was a huge music lover and believed that singing brought people, not just men, but people, closer to God and made them happy. I have to agree. So, sadly, no Bach for me, at least in this particular time travel venture. I'm not at all sure that making my choice on the basis of exactly which music I could have participated in and listened to is the very best way to make this kind of decision. We do not actually live by music alone. It does nourish the spirit, but it doesn't directly nourish the body. It doesn't always cover the bills, nor was the available compensation for orchestral musicians back in those times any guarantee of safe, clean, comfortable lodgings, freedom from wars, freedom from mean bosses, providing any job security, freedom from the really appalling increase in pollution and waves of disease that these big cities were subject to in this period. If I have to decide on one place on the basis of the music, I painfully decide that I would probably brave filthy, chaotic, exciting, cosmopolitan London during the time of Handel. Looking back at the other choices that I have shown to you in imagery and music, here are some of the downsides. Vienna, in King Ferdinand III's time, where Bieber and Schmelzer were. The 30 Years' War, which killed 7 or 8 million people at least, was ongoing. And a terrible wave of plague struck the city and killed Schmelzer, in fact. There were repeated waves of plague in Vivaldi's Venice. I don't want to be exposed to that. This is not pleasant, right? While plague appears to have spared Versailles, Versailles and Paris in general were hit by smallpox epidemics, so severe that in the early part of the 18th century, combined, they killed 1 in 10 French children. I don't want smallpox, you know? In addition to the disease issue, working in the French courts probably was the worst social situation you could imagine, unless you're just a ruthless social climbing sociopath. All courts of that time were almost certainly filled with backstabbers and want to get to the toppers and all the rest of that. But apparently, the French carried it to an art form. It must have been absolutely beyond stressful and brutal to be a normal, sane, humane human being in those courts. So I'm looking at all of these choices and looking at the positives and the negatives, and it reminds me of a little story my mom told me, a little joke she told me when I was little. She said, "Would you rather be chased by a lion or a tiger?" And I thought, I couldn't get the answer, and she said, "If it were me, I'd rather that the lion chased the tiger." In other words, can I just opt out of this situation? And in fact, that's what I'm actually going to do, because I can do anything. I can time travel away from anybody's displeasure at my refusal to completely answer this question. But I'm going to do it in an interesting way, I hope. When I consider the current time and place, I have realized, partly as a result of researching this answer, how very fortunate I am, and really how very fortunate we all are. As a woman, I have experienced no meaningful barriers in my journey as a professional musician. If you leave COVID-19 out of the thought process here, I am fortunate to live in a reasonably safe, clean, and prosperous world. And if I am to judge this time and place on what music I can perform here and now, I can play virtually anything. The music of all of the cities and courts of all of Europe, including the myriad that I didn't even mention, that music is all available to me now, and it's available to you. Thinking back, if I had been in Schmelzer's court, if I had chosen that as my answer, I would never have heard Rameau. I would never have heard Bach or Vivaldi or Handel or Telemann, any of them, because they weren't even born yet, right? So living in a certain time comes with certain restrictions. In terms of the amount of music available to us, living now is practically not restrictive at all. The only music that I might never hear now is music which has been lost in the intervening centuries. So, my real choice is to decline the time travel. Wait, I might just use my time vessel to go back to that time when I had a memory lapse in the middle of a Vivaldi concerto and fix it forever. But truthfully, I am delighted to be here and now, and a subject of the court of public opinion. Stay well until we meet again.